No, I just said that would come on. We have all our jurors back.
Yes, Your Honor.
Judge, I have an issue to bring up before you make a decision.
Mr. Krause, did you say you have something you need to bring up?
Yes, sir. Judge, I would ask for a jury out hearing on any future witness, lay witness called by the defense that's going to discuss any type of sexual assault that has no direct relation to the defendant.
All right. We will, I don't see any problem with doing that. It would seem to me that this last witness testified about sexual assault committed by the defendant's father, but it did not relate it to the defendant himself, and I think he only testified he'd been around the defendant on 2 occasions, if I understood him correctly, but we will address that in each individual witness. Mr. Evans, are you ready to call your next witness? Who will that be?
Dr. Dale Watson.
All right, so we will need the jury then. Go ahead and bring the jury in. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are ready now to proceed with the next witness. Mr. Evans, you may call your next witness.
Your Honor, the defense will call Dr. Dale Watson.
Do solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you give in this case be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Good afternoon, Dr. Watson.
Good afternoon.
Please state your full name, spelling your last for the benefit of the jury and the court reporter.
Dale Glenn Watson, DALEGLENN
Dr. Watson, what do you do for a living?
I am a neuropsychologist.
And how long have you been a neuropsychologist?
30 years.
And where's your primary office?
It's in Antioch, California. I was previously practicing in Pinole, but that office closed.
And tell the jury a little bit about your academic background.
I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from Sonoma State College in California. I have a master's degree in clinical psychology from John F. Kennedy University, also in California, and a PhD from the California School of Professional Psychology, which was then in Berkeley, California.
And what year did you obtain your PhD?
1988.
And do you have any other specializations or education beyond your graduation with your PhD in 1988?
I don't have any other education other than continuing education, and every year we, as psychologists, we have to keep up with the literature and with going to workshops and additional training.
And what's the difference between a psychologist and a neuropsychologist?
So every psychologist is every neuropsychologist is a psychologist as well. So you get a degree in psychology with additional experience and training, then you can become a neuropsychologist. And so most of my early career experiences were in traumatic brain injury rehab, in substance abuse assessment. So through experience and training, I became a neuropsychologist.
Sure. I'm going to pass forward a copy of your curriculum vitae. Do you recognize that to be your CV?
I do.
And have you also taught in the area of psychology?
I have, yes.
And where?
At the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California. WRIGHT.
And how long did you do that?
About 20 years.
Okay. And have you also done presentations for other individuals in the area of your field of study?
I have, yes.
And about how many times?
That's hard to say. Probably 100 times. I do a lot of training of attorneys in terms of the role of neuropsychology in forensic assessments.
Your Honor, I would move Dr. Watson's CV in as the next numbered exhibit.
It would be marked as Exhibit 269.
And have you testified before in court and been tendered as an expert in the area of neuropsychology?
I have, yes.
Approximately how many times?
Dozens and dozens.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time I would proffer Dr. Watson, or tender Dr. Watson as a expert in neuropsychology.
Any objection from the state? All right. Dr. Watson will be qualified as an expert in neuropsychology.
So, Dr. Watson, at some point were you contacted about engaging in this case in reference to Stephen Wiggins?
I was, yes.
And what was the question presented to you, or the issue presented to you, that you were asked to investigate and opine on?
So I was asked to determine if he had neurocognitive deficits or neuropsychological deficits, and to describe those deficits if they existed.
Okay. And what steps did you take in order to try to answer those questions?
So I reviewed records. I interviewed Mr. Wiggins. I performed a battery of neuropsychological tests over the course of 3 days in about 17 hours. And I eventually prepared a report.
And you said you conducted certain testing on Mr. Wiggins?
Yes.
Now, did you also, in preparation for your testimony today, do a PowerPoint presentation?
I did, yes.
I want to pass forward a PDF version of that. Tell me if you recognize that.
I do.
Your Honor, I would move Dr. Watson's PowerPoint presentation in as the next numbered exhibit and ask to be published.
270.
Yes, sir.
So, Dr. Watson, where do you start? When you get contacted by someone like me and asked to answer those questions, where do you start?
Well, I want to know what the question is. That's the beginning step, really. And then, I want to do an evaluation. I have a pretty broad battery that I use. It's very extensive. And so I'm going to do some testing.
And how do you determine what test you need to do?
So there's some established batteries. That's the referral question. So there are some established batteries of tests that have been around. Some of them began in the 1940s. So there's a lot of research literature about their validity and their ability to assess for brain damage and for deficits. And so I want to use something that has established validity. And so I have a couple of core batteries that I use. And then there are newer tests that assess kind of more subtle aspects of it or more extensively in some areas. And so I add those kinds of tests as well.
Okay. And are you able to make that determination before you meet with Mr. Wiggins based on your review of records, the type of testing that you want to complete?
I use a pretty standard battery, so that could influence my judgment about this, but I'm going to pretty much do the test battery that I do.
Okay. And so walk the jury through the steps you took in conducting the evaluation and coming to your findings in reference to Mr. Wiggins.
Okay. So do you want me to talk about conclusions or?
Yes, I want you to go ahead and kind of give your summary of your conclusions and then obviously get more details.
Sure. Okay. So overall, his level of dysfunction was pretty mild overall. And so I wanted to know, because I did know that there was a brain lesion, a hole in his head essentially, so I wanted to get some more detail. I wanted to get specific tests that would assess different areas of the brain. And so when I did that, it was very apparent that the major deficit he had, there were three deficit areas, but the major one was around behavioral control. It's very impulsive. There were processing speed deficits as well, and there were some attentional problems. Those were the primary three deficits. And so that was kind of my overall conclusion. Now, I also did IQ testing, so I knew roughly what his IQ was. His full-scale IQ was 89, which is at the 23rd percentile, which means that he was brighter than about 23% of the population of his aged individuals. About 77 or so would be brighter than him, 77%. So he's overall in the low average. But there were differences in his abilities in different areas. For example, his verbal comprehension was decent at 93. That's an average score, 32nd percentile. Not really something I would say would be impaired. His perceptual reasoning, which is the ability to put blocks together to make shapes or to see something visual and reason through a problem, those things were at 102. That's perfectly average. That's a pretty good score. And then working memory was a little bit weaker, and this is kind of the ability to hold information in your mind just briefly. The equivalent of saying somebody tells you a telephone number and you hold it in your head long enough to dial it. That's kind of what working memory is. And so he's got a little bit of weakness in that area at 18th percentile. But then processing speed is at 79. Now that's in a range we call the borderline range. So that's not great. That's much weaker and at the 8th percentile. And this is basically the ability to do something that's pretty simple. They're not complicated tasks. They're like clerical tasks or coding tasks. and you're really measuring the speed how fast they can do it. And that tells you something about how fast they can process information. And he's relatively slow in that area. So we can tell from just this part of it that he has some difficulties in the efficiency with which he processes information, particularly in how quickly he can do things. The other things that were apparent was that when he's under time pressure, he gets impulsive, he makes mistakes. And typically these are things where you're not thinking about them. You're doing things without much thought. The other area that he had difficulty was in visual attention, and that was at times severely impaired. And then the impulsivity was pretty severely impaired as well. That was a real significant deficit. So the most important part of all of this, and this is kind of my overall conclusion, is the central problem that he has is that he can't really regulate his behaviors very well. He's a bit erratic, he's impulsive, does things without thinking. He can be overly reactive, and this is based on the testing where he's overreactive to both visual and auditory stimuli. And then he gets emotionally labile, has low frustration tolerance as well, and then has visual attention deficits.
So what's it mean to be emotionally labile?
To get really irritated easily, to be, to fly off the handle, basically.
And before we get to this next slide, did you, in coming to this conclusion, was it just based on the testing you did, or did this also incorporate your review of reports from other experts?
Well, it's primarily let me explain the role of the different elements of this. So there are lots of different ways to look at the brain. You can have a picture of it. You have a structural image of it. You can have PET scans that tells you, what parts of the brains are active. Neuropsychology takes it from a different perspective, which is a behavioral perspective. I'm testing about how he behaves. What's his memory like? What's his attention like? So it's a different perspective, and so these conclusions are based upon my evaluation from that perspective. Although, I'm going to take into consideration the neuroimaging stuff, the early behavioral history, all of those different elements of it to come to my overall conclusions.
And with the conclusions that you found, were those deficits that you found consistent with what you saw in the neuroimaging and those reports from the other experts?
Yes.
And specifically the part of the brain where the hole was?
That's correct. That's an area of the brain that's very much involved in behavioral control, in modulating emotion. And so the results that I found were very consistent with the neuroimaging data.
So when you're doing this testing on Mr. Wiggins, you're sitting with him, I think you said, in a room for 17 hours over a course of several days, correct?
Over the course of 3 days, yes.
And so the next big question is a concept called malingering.
Yes.
What is that?
Malingering is basically faking, pretending you have something wrong when you don't. In any forensic context, that's always a question. You want to make sure that you have valid data. You don't want somebody to be putting one over on you, and that you can actually come to real conclusions and not something they simply are pretending to have or faking.
And was there any indication, based on your testing, that Mr. Wiggins was faking or malingering?
I think it was virtually impossible. And the reason I say that is that I gave 5 standalone measures, which are tests specifically designed to identify malingering and cognitive malingering, neuropsychological malingering. Some of them are considered gold standard tests, which means that they are in the field the ones that are most highly respected and trusted the most. He passed all of those. I also then used 21 separate indices embedded within other tests. So they're not dedicated to be malingering tests, but they're part of other tests. And he passed all of those too, which was quite unusual that somebody would be able to pass all of those. One of the gold standard tests, I'll show you later, was administered to psychologists who were asked to fake, and they couldn't beat the test either. So these are very sensitive tests and very solid tests in terms of that. So I consider the test valid. I don't think there was very much chance that he was faking.
And if I'm understanding you correctly, if there was an indication, it would have shown in the test results?
It would have shown in those test results, yeah. I've caught people who are faking, They'll fail these tests. And so, they're sensitive to people malingering.
And after you determine, this issue of malingering or not, where do you go next in your evaluation?
Well, these tests are scattered throughout the battery. So, I do some on the first day, the second day, the third day. So I want to make sure he's, consistently not faking. So one of the first tests I'll do is the IQ test, which I showed you the results of that, and then I'll delve more deeply into the other elements of it.
And how do you get to the where you're honing in on the specific deficits through the testing?
You want to neuropsychological tests assess a broad array of different parts of the brain. So we have tests that assess the parietal lobe, back in the back. That's spatial stuff. And then I also have tests that assess memory. So that's temporal lobe, by the temples. And then I have a lot of tests that assess frontal lobe function as well, executive functions. And so all of these tests will either assess a specific area or a broad part of the brain.
And can you walk us through your PowerPoint, kind of where you go next in your investigation?
Sure. So this is just an example of one of the malingering tests. This is Green's word memory test. It's considered the gold standard within the field. And what it shows, Mr. Wiggins' scores are the blue line at the top. And that's at basically right at average. That's exactly where it should be if he's not faking. I compared it to people with epileptic seizure disorders who also passed the word memory test. It's hard to see on this slide, but it's right below his blue line. And then I also compared it to the 2 bottom lines. That's 20 patients asked to fake impairment and sophisticated volunteer simulators. Those were the psychologists who were trying to fake. And you'll see the pattern that they have. So the first one is IR, which is immediate recognition. One of the ways we assess this is we will give them pairs of words, and then later on, immediately after they've learned a list of 40 words, we'll say, was dog on the list? Yes or no. Was cat on the list? Yes or no. Some of them were on the list and some were not. And people who are trying to fake memory problems will say, no, I don't recognize that one, or yes, that was on the list and it really wasn't. And so that immediate recognition, you see the drop in that, the 2 bottom lines, those are people who are trying to fake. And then there's a delayed recall, which is half an hour later, we do that again. Was dog on the list? Was cat on the list? And again, the fakers are getting poorer. This is actually a very easy test. And so people who are really trying their best, including people with, who are trying to retain custody of their children in custody evaluations, they're all at the top there, along with Mr. Wiggins. And so what you see then is for the fakers, the first three are malingering tests. The others are actually more memory tests. And it's hard to fake the real memory tests until you see them creeping up towards the normal range, whereas the people who are being genuine on the test are all along that blue line with Mr. Wiggins. So that's an indicator that he's not trying to fake any kind of memory problem. So that was one of the standalone tests. Now, I also did an embedded measure, and this is just an example of one of the 21 different embedded measures. It's called reliable digit span, and it's how many digits he can remember. So if I say 5, 6, 7, 9, can he repeat that? And so he did, and he performed better than 25% of the normative sample. If they were down below that in the 10 or 5%, you're going to think, that doesn't sound right, because people should be able to do this. And so we've got both these standalone and embedded measures to assess this. Now, these are just some of the records that I reviewed as well. And they included some of the scans, but also early childhood records, including jail medical records and other records. So this is the list of tests that I administered. I'm not going to go into all of these, but it's 4 pages in length. And the truth is, I test more than most people do. Most neuropsychologists do not spend this kind of time doing an evaluation, but I think it's important to be thorough about it, and that's what I try to do.
And specifically, I know you mentioned being thorough, but and based on your professional standards, and why be so thorough?
The stakes are important. You want to be right about it, and it's a complex undertaking. So you can do screening tests, and you might catch something, but you might miss something as well. So you want to make sure you don't miss anything, and so you want to be thorough.
Now, out of all the information that you reviewed about Mr. Wiggins' history, what did you deem to be important as it related to your evaluation?
So we know he had a seizure disorder that began at about age 14. And so that's an indication that there's something wrong with his brain. There's some sort of irritation going on in his brain that causes this kind of electrical disruption in his brain, causes a seizure. He also had incurred multiple head injuries, including some in childhood. Being tased and falling and hitting his head was another one. He also had a substantial methamphetamine abuse history, and that can be a factor in brain dysfunction as well. He had also had early behavioral problems. And one of the physicians who evaluated him, I think he was only 5 years of age, he documented auditory and visual hallucinations. He thought it was schizophrenia and gave the diagnosis of schizophrenia. I don't think that's what it was. I think it was the seizure disorder causing auditory and visual hallucinations, which is something that happens in seizure disorders. But this was an important kind of element, particularly given that we have this early behavioral disruption. We know that there's something going on with this kid that is different, and to be evaluated by a physician at 4 or 5 and be diagnosed with schizophrenia, that's it's unheard of. It just doesn't happen. So it was very unusual.
And before you move to the next slide, you noted head injury. So why would the head injuries be important? Why are you documenting those or highlighting them?
Sure. So again, my early experience in my training in my early career was in traumatic brain injury. And so virtually all traumatic brain injuries affect the frontal lobes. Dr. Bigler, I think, showed you, he had a skull, a model of a skull. It's very sharp right there. The skull is sharp at the base of the frontal lobes, and it tends to cut parts of the brain. And so any traumatic brain injury can be significant, particularly if there's loss of consciousness. If it's a concussion, people do recover from concussions pretty easily. But if you have loss of consciousness, it can be much more severe, and that can be can cause brain injuries.
Thank you. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I did want some clarification. So thank you.
Yeah. I think, well, there's other things as well. So he was also treated for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder with medication. Brain problem will manifest as ADHD a lot of times. There's something wrong going on, but in Mr. Wiggins' case, we know that it was much more severe than simply ADHD because he's got that hole in his head. And that looks like a developmental defect. The other thing, well, go ahead.
What do you mean by developmental defect?
Something that occurred very early in the development, either in utero or early in childhood. It's something that's always been there or been there a very long time. The other thing that I found really important was that Dr. Karen found that he had a shortened left arm as well as some facial anomalies. That's got to be a developmental defect because you can't, that's just not going to happen in an acquired injury. So we have two kinds of injuries. We can have an acquired injury, such as a head injury, or we can have a developmental defect, which is something that's just been there for, throughout development.
Was there anything else about his history that you found to be material to your evaluation?
So the brain scans were really important as well, just understanding the nature of the lesions that he had.
And why were they important? I mean, when you looked at those brain scans in reference to the testing that you did.
There was a very nice matchup. So the brain scans showed primarily right hemisphere lesions. He's got that defect in the frontal lobe, that exactly what you would expect in somebody who is so impulsive. So there was encephalomalacia or softening of that right inferior frontal lobe. That was, I thought, very significant. You just don't see that. I've never seen a hole like that, frankly, in images. And those areas are really important for behavioral control, social cognition, emotional regulation, and those are the kinds of deficits that I was seeing as well. So we had a really nice overlay of both the neuroimaging and the neuropsychological results.
You familiar with the term response control?
Yes.
And can you explain what response control is to the truth?
So it's basically how well you can self-regulate. One of the really important brain functions, and particularly of the frontal lobes, is being able to regulate oneself. To, if you think of a young children, how they can get really upset really easily over minor things. They just get really upset. They haven't developed that cognitive control over those things to manage their emotions. So, response inhibition is part of that. I think it was referred to as the brakes. So I think of the frontal lobes as both the gas pedal and the brakes. Some people have trouble initiating behavior, other people have trouble inhibiting or stopping behavior, putting on the brakes. And so response control is the same.
And based on your evaluation of Mr. Wiggins and his brain deficits, does he have an issue with response control?
He does, yes.
And that's based upon, or is that based upon the damage to that frontal lobe?
I believe it is, yes.
So other than the brain scans, was there other materials that you were able to synthesize?
I think that, I mean, those are the kind of things that I was paying attention to. One of the issues was I wanted to know, was he on medication at the time of the evaluation, and how, make some judgments about how that might affect the results of the testing.
And so you're kind of leading to it, but why is that important for you, whether he's on medications at the time of the eval or not?
So some medications will help his performance on the neuropsych testing. So he was on Keppra and Tegretol. Both of those are anticonvulsants, and so they tend to calm the brain down. And so I want to look at how that might affect the testing. He was also on Haldol. Now Haldol, I took Haldol once. I had hiccups, and I went to the emergency room, and the treatment for hiccups that won't go away is also Haldol. And so I was given a dose of Haldol. I could hardly move. I mean, it really had a significant effect. I had to be helped out of the hospital to go home. So Haldol is a very powerful medication. It tends to really dampen behavior down. And so I wanted to make sure that that wasn't a factor in these test results. Now, for Mr. Wiggins, it really helped him. It calmed the voices, so he wasn't bothered by the voices so much. And it also helped him sleep. So he's had chronic sleep problems, so that helped him sleep. So I had to look at the test results to make sure that what I was seeing was not simply the effect of these medications that were dampening down the brain activity, and that I was really seeing deficit and not simply medication effects.
And so how do you do that? How can you tell the difference?
You look at the patterns. For example, I don't know if I have it next, but yeah, so this talks a little bit more about them. So they stabilize, these are mood stabilizers. And so in the sense that his mood wasn't disrupted, that would improve performance. He could focus better on the testing. And Haldol, again, can be sedating. He didn't seem sedated to me. He wasn't, he wasn't falling asleep. He wasn't seeming to be drifting off. Could cause attention problems, but it would not cause problems with impulsivity. The other part of it was that I looked at both auditory and visual attention with the same test, and he had problems in attention both auditorily and visually, but the impulsivity was just visually. So if it was the Haldol, it would affect both. And so it's the deficit that I'm seeing is not because of the Haldol. It's really because there's a difference in how his brain processes. Now, we know that the lesion is a right hemisphere lesion. That's going to affect visual processing more than it affects auditory processing. And so we see that difference, and it's based upon the lesion itself.
Let's move to your next slide, Dr. Watson. So the question that you pose on that slide, so how would his functioning now be different than it was at the time of the crime? So can you explain that for the jury?
Yes. So this is kind of a truism in the field, is that if you have somebody who's in a structured setting, their behavior is going to improve. It's part of the reason in head injury treatment we put people in structured treatment settings to assist them in rehabilitating themselves. So structure improves performance. Medication, appropriate medication, will also improve performance as well. And certainly, you know, if he's not using drugs, if he's not using methamphetamine, his performance is going to be much better than it was during a time when he was using meth. So I would think that I probably saw him at his best, and that he probably was functioning more poorly during the time of the crime.
Is there a way that you can differentiate when you say specifically that he would likely be functioning he would have been substantially more impaired at the time versus at the time of your testing? How are you making that clear distinction?
Yeah, it's a clinical judgment, knowing that structure helps people,
Okay.
Knowing that appropriate medication helps people, and knowing that methamphetamine is going to make people much worse.
And you're also able to observe Mr. Wiggins, correct?
That's correct.
And I think you mentioned even in reference to the Haldol, are you observing him during your time with him over those long periods of time to determine how alert he is?
I was, and he was alert. I mean, that wasn't an issue.
Thank you. Let's move to your next slide. And again, I want you to focus in and explain to the jury some of the things you find to be most significant about your eval.
Okay. So one of the tests I gave him was called the IVA-2, or Integrated Visual and Auditory 2 Continuous Performance Test. This is a computer-generated test. Continuous performance tests have been used for many years within the field to assess attention and also impulsivity. And so the way the test works is that he's either seeing a 1 or a 2 on the screen. And so if he sees a 1, he should click. He should click the mouse. If he sees a 2, he shouldn't do anything. But also, if he hears a 2, he shouldn't do anything. Or if he hears a 1, he should click. And these things are coming very quickly, 1s, 2s, 1s, 2, and you've got to make a judgment virtually instantaneously whether to click or not to click the mouse button. And so in this way, it's pulling for people to be impulsive. Now, there are other continuous performance tests that are really just measuring attention. This one is specifically designed to both measure attention but also impulsivity. And that's an important element of this test. And so the real problem he had was in this kind of what is called response control. He had attentional problems as well, but the response control was the impulsivity. He just didn't stop himself. And so when there were changes in the stimuli, and by analogy in the environment, he's going to have difficulties with this impulsivity. So one of the scores was, it's called auditory prudence. And this is measuring the impulsivity. He's down at the 1st percentile, so he's extremely impaired. Now, the visual prudence was also at the 1st percentile, which means he's extremely impaired. 99% of the population would be doing better than he was on this. He just was making errors because he wasn't stopping. And so we can also look at attention. His global auditory sustained attention, which is basically his ability to stay focused both when the stimuli are coming fast or slow, was a standard score of 98, which translates to a percentile rank of 46. Pretty average. 50 is perfectly average. So auditory attention, not a problem. Visual attention, he's at the 2nd percentile. And so we get this difference between auditory and visual attention, with the visual attention being impaired. Now, this is vigilance. Vigilance is the ability to sustain attention over time, to not lose focus. And again, so auditory vigilance, he's at the 62nd percentile. He's actually better than average. But visual vigilance is at the 2nd percentile rank. And again, we have this distinction between auditory and visual vigilance. Another one of the measures from this test is called elasticity. And this is basically the ability to be flexible mentally, to make quick changes, to see that things have changed in the environment and adjust behavior. And his auditory elasticity was 104, 62nd percentile. He's fine. But visual elasticity was again at the 1st percentile. And so he was failing to click the ones which immediately followed a 2 under high demand conditions. So he would get stuck in a mental rut. And so if there was a 2 and it was coming fast, then he would not press the 1. And so he had trouble getting back on track. So he couldn't reorganize himself very well. And again, we see the difference between auditory and visual vigilance, or elasticity in this case, rather. So those were attentional measures. Now we go to impulsivity measures. And so prudence is a measure of impulsivity as defined by errors of commission. Commission errors are pressing the mouse button when you're not supposed to be pressing the mouse button. And so for auditory prudence, he was again at the 1st percentile. And again, he's just overreactive. This is different than his attention. Now we're in the impulsivity range, and it's affecting auditory as well as visual impulsivity.
Can you explain a little further overreactive
Yes.
in that context?
Yeah, so again, it's this not stopping himself. You know, he's supposed to not press the mouse button. He just can't stop himself. So, you know, people who are not impaired in this test, it's given to large samples of people, and we know what average people do and what people who don't have problems with impulsivity do. And he's not one of those. He has problems with impulsivity because he doesn't stop himself very effectively.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Watson.
So again, now on visual prudence, he's again down at the 1st percentile. And this is the problem with response control. So he's going to be distracted and overreactive to visual and auditory information, for that matter, in the environment. And he's going to have trouble shifting sets. Shifting sets meaning realizing that something's changed and I've got to change my behavior. He doesn't catch that. He gets stuck in this kind of rut. I call it a kind of mental rut, where they just have trouble getting out of it. And so both auditory and visual impulsivity measures are impaired. Now, this is what is called a normal curve, and it just, a lot of psychological functions are distributed around a normal curve. The top of the curve, right in the middle, that's what average is. About 68% of people will fall within, one standard deviation, or that first bar around. That's considered average. And then, and some of his performances on those auditory tests were pretty much in that range. On the other hand, we get down to on the left side, where the tail of that curve is getting very narrow. He's down there in that first percentile. So, way down there at the end where very few people fall. And that's where he's falling in a lot of these measures, both of visual attention, but auditory and visual response control. He's impaired in those areas. So this is simply a looking at the IVA-2 for the identification of ADHD. It can be used for ADHD, but also for brain damage in general. So this is just some of the research on ADHD. Its sensitivity is 92%, which means that in this study, it accurately identified 92% of the people who had ADHD. But it's also important not to over-identify a disorder when it's not present. And so the specificity tells us that it accurately said that 90% of the people who did not have ADHD did not have ADHD. So it's a pretty good test in terms of its accuracy. 90 and above is considered where you want to be. It's accurately identifying problems in attention.
Before you talk about your summary, why would you give Mr. Wiggins the ADHD test?
Well, he was diagnosed with that in childhood, and if you read descriptions of his early behavior, he's pretty disruptive and a little bit out of control. And so, that's what you would expect. You want to look at, response inhibition, control issues.
And as far as the testing with Mr. Wiggins on that particular test, what were your findings?
He has very significant visual attention deficits and auditory and visual impulsivity or response control deficits.
And when you're evaluating that or in considering that in reference to all the other things you reviewed in reference to Mr. Wiggins' brain, what does that tell you about Mr. Wiggins?
He has significant, we know he has significant brain problems, and this is consistent with those kinds of same, the lesion of his brain and the various lesions of his brain. This is very consistent. There's a right hemisphere focus to begin with, and that's found in the testing as well. And so he just has difficulty regulating his own behavior. He gets impulsive and doesn't deal with change very well.
And let me ask you this. There's a lot of distinction between auditory and visual stimuli. And it's fair to say he reacts different. There's a difference in how he reacts to one or the other, correct?
In terms of attention, yes. Not so much in terms of response control.
And just briefly tell us the difference between the two. I know you've talked about it some, but response control specifically.
Okay. So attention is, he doesn't click the mouse button when he should. He drifts off, misses things that he should be. So that's attention. The response control is clicking when he should not be clicking. So not inhibiting himself. So we see both problems. The response control is pretty significantly a deficit. So he's impulsive. He's acting without inhibiting himself, without stopping himself.
Is that something, when you're talking about this and someone with those brain deficits, is it a conscious thought to just go ahead and do something?
It's acting without thought, actually.
Okay. And is it your opinion that that's a direct result of the brain damage that he has?
It is, yes.
And I didn't mean to interrupt you on this summary. I know we've already kind of went through it, and if you need to move to the next slide, go ahead.
Okay. So this is really taken from the computer-generated report. It's not something I actually wrote, but I thought it was salient to this, or meaningful to the kind of situation. The problem with response control indicates that the person is likely to be overreactive to or distracted by auditory and visual stimuli in the environment. It also indicates that he may have problems shifting mental sets and inhibiting responses to changes in his environment. This individual is likely to have significant functional problems in his life and may be emotionally labile. An individual with this profile is likely to exhibit anger control problems and low frustration tolerance. In some cases, this individual's extreme difficulties with impulse control are likely to result in acting out, irritability, and negative verbalizations. These emotional problems are likely to significantly exacerbate social interactions with peers. Depending on the severity of this type of behavior, others may minimize contact with him or avoid him altogether, resulting in him feeling not liked by others and alienated. Given the severity of his problems, appropriate medications and/or intensive therapeutic interventions may need to be considered to help this individual. And again, that was not those are not words I wrote. Those are taken directly from the computer-generated report.
And just very, very briefly, you said something negative verbalization. What is that?
You know, cursing people out, things like that.
And we talked about that response control issue. If I understood you, that would apply to his actions, right? And inability to acting without thinking.
Yes.
Would the same be said for speaking without thinking or saying things without thinking?
Yes.
And you would expect this negative verbalization, him to potentially lash out or say things without thinking with someone with his brain damage?
Yes.
Move to your next slide, please.
So he tends to make careless errors. He has difficulty putting on the brakes. The individual's problems are considered to be more severe and are likely to have a greater negative impact on his day-to-day functioning because they occur both in auditory and visual domains. So he doesn't have something to fall back on as a kind of resource or backstop. It occurs in both visual and auditory domains. Makes it more severe.
You move to the next slide. Is this so? This is still, we're still talking. Are we still talking about the summary for that one particular test, the IBA-2?
We are. That's right. So again, the findings are really consistent with Mr. Wiggins' description of his own behavior. He told me that absent Haldol, people think he's angry all the time. And it's also consistent with the localized hole in the frontal lobe of his brain, as well as the smaller kind of areas of damage to the white matter as well.
So, particularly, everything that you've talked about with Mr. Wiggins, with his impulsivity, after you've done IQ testing and all the other testing, with his particular brain damage, does that mean that he lacks the ability to reason?
No. I think it's important to understand that there's not one executive function. There are actually several executive functions. And in some of those executive functions, the ability to problem solve and to reason, he's actually able to do those things. He's not impaired in those areas. It's just one specific area of this kind of ability to inhibit and control his behavior. That's the deficit. Other areas are not impaired.
So, would he be able to complete tasks?
Yeah, he completed a lot of tasks with me, absolutely.
And when you talk about, throughout your presentation and your testimony today, you talked about stimuli several different times. Is that a good way of saying stressful situation or stressors?
Some of them are stressors, some are not so stressful, and so we can make a distinction between those kinds of different stimuli.
Would you expect to see this type of impulsivity that Mr. Wiggins has based on his brain damage if he were faced with in a stressful situation?
They would tend to be worse, yes.
And move to the next slide. All right, and after testing Mr. Wiggins in that area, what does that tell you about his behavior specifically?
Yeah, so he has problems in cognitive efficiency, specifically in processing speed. He's a little slower. He's not grossly impaired, but he's slower. And then when his speed increases, he tends to makes more errors, impulsive errors. And then, so in high demand conditions or stressful situations, his visual attention, both auditory and visual attention, can be impaired, and he has trouble getting back on track and be very impulsive at times.
And when you're talking about his deficits as it relates to his behavior, what's the most important deficit from your perspective?
Problems with self-regulation, response control, inability to inhibit.
Let's go to your next slide.
And your ultimate, I know we talked about summary earlier, but based on all of the testing and review of documents and meeting with Stephen and all the information, what were your ultimate conclusions as it related to Stephen Wiggins?
Yeah, so the results of my testing match very nicely the results of the scans, the brain scans Dr. Bigler talked about, Dr. Karen talked about, Dr. Newberg talked about as well. And so he has a significantly damaged brain that manifests in behavioral discontrol, particularly under stress. And they're very consistent. My findings were very consistent with that early childhood history as well. He's got early seizure onset. He's got history of traumatic brain injury. He's got a doctor saying he's schizophrenic at 4 or 5, and I don't think he's schizophrenic, but that's what a doctor thought because he was having symptoms. He was having hallucinations. He's been diagnosed with ADHD. And he has a history of substance abuse. And so all of those factors are going to be impacting his brain. A lot of these are developmental, so they occurred early in childhood. They've been lifelong. And he's had lifelong problems in behavioral control.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. Pass the witness.
Mr. White, you may ask.
Thank you. Afternoon, doctor.
Good afternoon.
So you tested Mr. Wiggins for 17 hours over 3 days, correct?
Yes.
During that time, did you observe tattoos?
Yes.
What tattoos did you observe?
Objection.
I'm sorry, I was consulting about something. What was your,
May we approach?
yes, you may. Ladies and gentlemen, if you step across the hall, if you will, please. The reason I didn't hear the question per se is I was inquiring as to whether or not this report was made an exhibit. To my knowledge, it was not. The report was never made the report was not made an exhibit, I don't think, by the defense. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. So what specifically are you referring to, Mr. Wyatt, if you could point me to the portion of the report you're referring to?
Yes, Your Honor, I'm looking to the report. 15? 14, thank you. On page 14, Your Honor, during the mental status and behavioral observations,
Now, is this the report or what was made the exhibit?
this is the report.
Okay. On page 14.
And it's in the middle of the paragraph, the first paragraph under mental status and behavioral observations.
Okay, it is referred to that he has tattoos. So what is the point of your question, just to make the point that he has tattoos?
What's the significance of writing it in the report?
All right,
That's the question.
and that's the only question you have?
That's the only question I have, because he said the ones we're interested in are not on his hands or arms. But the doctor makes a point of it. Surely he put it in there for a reason. I'd like to know the
All right,
reason.
let's ask the question outside the presence of the jury. And
So, doctor, you observed tattoos on the defendant,
Yes.
and what was the purpose of stating so in your report?
Anytime you do a mental status examination, which is a kind of standard element of a psychological or psychiatric evaluation, you make a behavioral observation. It's just an observation.
It has no bearing on any sort of mental ability or disability?
Not particularly.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
so do you still wish to ask that in the presence of the jury with that response?
Yes.
Defense?
Your Honor, even based on the response, it's not relevant. Of course, not evidence.
I'm going to allow the question for that limited purpose of establishing the fact that if there's a mention of it in the report and he states that it's an overall observation, then I think that goes to his, what he includes in his report and what he's basing his observations upon. I don't know that it really adds a lot to it, but I think it does go to the issue of his observations and what he takes into consideration. So I'll allow the question.
Thank you.
That you're going no further with the
That's it.
tattoos other than that.
That's it.
Bring the jury back. And I would add for the record that just observing the defendant in the courtroom with there are tattoos that are visible just as he sits in the courtroom on his hands and things, so it's not like this is going to be
I understand.
All right, Mr. Wyatt?
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Watson, in your report on page 14, you note that the defendant had tattoos on his arms and hands, correct?
Correct.
I guess what's the significance of putting that in your report?
It's a fairly standard element of any kind of psychiatric or psychological mental status exam. We always make behavioral observations, and that's simply an observation I made.
So it has no bearing on his abilities or disabilities mentally?
No.
Thank you. So during the 17 hours, the defendant never lost his temper?
No.
He didn't show any impulsiveness in his behaviors?
Well, he was impulsive in the testing, but he wasn't impulsive out overtly with me.
Okay, thank you. And during this, you spoke on it earlier, but during the testing, you assumed that he was not using or had not recently used methamphetamine.
I did assume that, yes.
In your review of records, I noticed that you did not review the interview of the defendant with Agent Nathan Neese from June 1st of 2018. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You stated his IQ was a score of 89 that includes processing speed, correct?
That's one of the elements that goes into it. It's kind of an average.
Okay. And then if you take out processing speed, it was a 97. Is that correct?
I'd have to look at that.
That's
if I
fine.
can. So if you take out working memory and processing speed, it's a 97, as opposed to if you just use those two by themselves, it's a 79.
Okay. So you stated that the defendant, has earned his GED, correct?
Yes.
And isn't it so that the GED test is designed for 40% of high school graduates to fail it?
I'm not aware of that specifically.
Doctor, would you agree that, or I guess the question is, the more tests you give, psychological tests, the higher the likelihood that you'll find abnormalities in the scores?
That's a possibility, and so the way to adjust for that is to look to see if the deficits that are identified matches the lesion that has been identified.
The defendant was oriented to person,
Yes,
oriented to place,
yes,
oriented to time,
correct,
to circumstances.
yes.
His mood was normal.
Yes, I would say so.
His affect was normal.
Yes,
He was friendly,
he was.
cooperative.
Yep,
He performed diligently on the tests.
I think that's true.
He invested in doing well, or is interested in doing well in the tests.
He seemed to be, yes.
He was particularly observant, wasn't he?
He was.
To the extent where he noticed that you had changed watches between 2 days.
That's correct.
The defendant demonstrated overall average levels of intellectual ability, correct?
Overall, that's true.
His word reading was below average, correct?
Yes,
His math was average.
that's correct.
Reading composite was average.
Correct.
His sentence comprehension was high average.
That's accurate.
And that's essentially the level of a college freshman, correct?
I've never quite done that. Yeah, but I guess that's accurate. It's about 12.9 grade level.
He quickly oriented to tasks.
Yeah, for the most part, that's true.
He demonstrated intact memory abilities.
That's largely true. There was one area, and I didn't really include this in the report, but he did have some problems with forgetting. I judged it to be relatively less important, but there was some difficulty with forgetting information.
His memory function was intact.
Largely so.
He can learn new information readily.
He did well on those kinds of tasks, yes.
His encoding and retrieval processes were largely unimpaired.
That's correct.
His language functions were unimpaired.
That's correct.
He had no difficulty with visual spatial judgment.
That's right.
His sensory processes were intact.
Yes.
His executive functioning tests revealed intact reasoning.
He had intact reasoning, and again, that's one element of what executive functions are about.
He was able to problem solve efficiently.
On some of the tests, that's correct.
He was able to reason adequately.
Yes.
He had capacity and cognitive flexibility.
Can you say that again?
He had cognitive flexibility.
Depending on the task, there were some tasks he had, he did fine on that, and then again on others tests he had difficulties.
He did not show signs of getting stuck in mental ruts, correct?
Not on the, you're referring to one specific test, and that's accurate.
Overall, the summary measures of the tests you gave the defendant showed his overall level of dysfunction was, as you said, at most in the mildly impaired range, correct?
That's correct. Those are kind of this average, so across average, yeah, mildly impaired. There are specific areas where not so, severely impaired, but on average, mild.
You would agree that clicking a mouse on a computer screen is much different than day-to-day situations you may encounter.
It is, although we use these to make judgments about other behaviors. Otherwise, we wouldn't do a test where you just have to click a mouse. You make judgments of how that's going to be in the real world.
And last but certainly not the least, he was not faking any of this.
He was not faking any of it.
Your Honor, the state would ask to move a copy of the report in as evidence.
Will be the next exhibit in order.
I'll pass the witness, Your Honor.
Dr. Watson, just a few questions. So the state just asked you about a concept, I guess it was referred to as intact reasoning,
Yes.
and I think your response was that was one, that he had intact reasoning, Mr. Wiggins, and that's one facet of executive function.
That's correct.
What's the other facet?
There's lots of different elements of it. One is generativity, and the other is, again, it's this brakes and gas pedal. So you have reasoning, that's an element of executive function, but you also have the ability to inhibit, to self-regulate. Those are really important
And
executive functions.
And when you see somebody with frontal lobe damage, like Mr. Wiggins, is it possible for him to have intact reasoning but still have an inability to self-regulate?
Absolutely.
And there was a question about his GED. And does the fact that Mr. Wiggins got his GED in any way affect your opinions about his damaged brain?
Not particularly. I mean, I do look at that in terms of what I would expect on the intelligence testing, and it's not inconsistent.
Thank you. Those are my questions.
Recross?
No, sir.
Thank you, Doctor. And you stepped down and you were released from your subpoena.
Thank you.
Mr. Evans, do you have another witness that will be short, or do you have a long witness?
So this next witness, Your Honor, will be the jury out.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, this might be a good time. We're going to have a hearing outside of the presence of your presence. So if you'll step across, let's just go ahead and make this your afternoon recess as well. All right, you said you need a jury out hearing on this?
Yes, Judge. I'm asking for the jury out, but I don't know who the witness is.
Anna Cannon?
Who?
Anna Cannon.
Anna Cannon, and what is the reason, why are we having a jury out hearing regarding Ms. Cannon?
Judge,
Judge, may we approach?
You may?
not on the record.
This is one of the witnesses related to.
Committed by any of the defendant's family members. Obviously, anything that personal interaction with the defendant would be relevant, but any of these historical crimes or allegations, a lot of them are just allegations that aren't directly tied to the defendant, they are not relevant to this proceeding.
And again, Mr. Evans, if you want to address that without referring to specifically what is the relevance of this type of information?
Your Honor, in a capital sentencing hearing, this jury is tasked with considering the defendant's social history is one of many factors. We have put on proof so far that was unobjected to of a social historian that went into great detail about the defendant's kind of genealogy, and then went into his father and the abuse he suffered at the hands of his father, and the abuse that his father inflicted on others. His cross-examination. Now, I think it's relevant because it's mitigation. It allows us to present evidence about the defendant and where he comes from. We're going to have an expert witness talking about the effects of childhood trauma, the effects of generational mental illness, and how that could have affected.
Do you have a witness that's going to correlate the fact that this particular witness that you're wanting to call was not only abused by Scott Wiggins, is that who I'm assuming it is?
Yes, Your Honor.
But that also that the defendant was aware of that, or was present, or was made aware of it in some fashion?
So, no, Your Honor. But
So then how is it related to anything?
well, again, I'll say this, two things. One, the social historian's already testified and it's in proof. The state then took it upon themselves, instead of not cross-examining that witness, and called into question the reliability of that information.
So are you saying the state has waived any objection to the information simply because they didn't object the first time?
And they've put it at
Is that a
issue.
rule of evidence that I'm unaware of?
Judge,
That
they've
once you object, if you don't object to something, you can never, ever be able to object to it?
Well, my first argument is it's relevant in a capital sentencing hearing to give context to the defendant's life. And if their indication, which is what they've indicated, is that Stephen Wiggins was necessarily not really abused by Scott Wiggins, and that's what they've indicated, that these are just stories and they weren't reported, then it is very relevant. And that these things didn't happen now that the jury's heard it and it was unobjected to. It would leave the inference with that jury's mind if we weren't able to corroborate it. And now we're bringing the witnesses in, they're going to say exactly what was said previously.
I understand, but since we are recording this, if you would stand at the podium when you're speaking to that microphone, it will help make sure that we have an accurate recording for the future. All right, so I'm understanding is that what you're wanting to do is introduce this testimony to try to establish the fact that this witness was abused by Scott Wiggins, so therefore it must be plausible that Scott Wiggins also abused Mr. Wiggins, the defendant.
Yes, Your Honor, to give a complete picture for the jury to see, again, the context of his social history and the environment for which he grew up on. And this idea, I mean, when Mr. Charlie Webb testified, the inference was, well, you didn't see this guy putting his hands on, you didn't see this guy, you didn't see Scott Wiggins putting his hands on his kids. He didn't do it when you were around.
He actually said he did see him grab him up and push him back in the back room, but
Yeah.
he didn't see him beating on him.
Yes.
So.
So I mean, Your Honor, this goes specifically to the type of person that would have done that would have been the type of person and was the person that it's relevant to mitigation.
Other than your social historian, is there someone that's going to testify on behalf of the defendant to the fact that Mr. Wiggins, the defendant, was terrorized by this individual? I know you have you're making the inference, but I'm just wondering. The social historian is just basically repeating, what he was told, which is allowable in a sentencing hearing. But
Oh, yes, Your Honor.
all right, let's go ahead and take our afternoon recess now. We'll be in recess for 15 minutes. So.